It's exactly 11:30. Thank you so much for being here. We're gonna get started. My name is Nougier. I'm the head of research and communications at the International Drug Policy Consortium. It's a real pleasure to be here again. Thanks so much to FHN for inviting me every year to moderate your side events, which are always an amazing space for discussion on innovative and rights-based reform. Thanks so much, first of all, to our co-sponsors. We have co-sponsors today that include Switzerland, Amnesty International, IDPC, the International Network of People Who Use Drugs, Transform, and Harm Reduction International. As I said earlier, FHN has been organizing these events every year for the past 5-6 years now, probably more.
Since 2008.
Well, exactly. And at the beginning it was around decriminalization, and then they started moving towards legal regulation. And today is another key moment to talk about meaningful reforms for people on the ground. I think we're all kind of shocked about the debates that are happening this year. The multilateral system overall is in crisis, but CND, I've been here for 15 years, coming every year, and this year, I don't know, it feels really unprecedented in terms of the pushback that we're getting on some basic fundamental human rights, gender, health principles. And I think it's all the more important that we have these spaces at side events where we can actually talk about meaningful things that's happening on the ground, that's impacting people every day. I'm really delighted to be here today to chair this amazing panel discussion that we have, to talk about some of the innovative approaches that are happening, or at least innovative ideas that are being brought forward by civil society all over the world. Before we move on to our actual panel, we'd like to show you a very brief extract from a video intervention that the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, gave at the European Harm Reduction Conference in Warsaw in December, where he made a fantastic speech. So I invite you to read or to actually view the whole video, but for now we'll have a 3-minute snapshot of what he said. That's going to put us in the mood for that side event. No, sound.
Has destroyed countless lives and damaged entire communities. We have record numbers of drug-related deaths, more people than ever with drug use disorders, and higher levels of the illegal production of many drugs. Criminalization and prohibition have failed to reduce drug use and failed to deter drug-related crime. These policies are simply not working. And we are failing some of the most vulnerable groups in our societies. We need a transformative approach. And the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy provide a framework for developing human rights-based approaches that prioritize health, dignity, and inclusion. Instead of punitive measures, we need gender-sensitive and evidence-based drug policies grounded in public health. Instead of scapegoating, we must ensure inclusive access to voluntary medical care and other social services. Harm reduction measures which prevent drug overdose-related fatalities are essential. Decriminalization is another crucial step towards a more humane and effective drug policy, accompanied by support for social reintegration. We need to start treating the person, not punishing the drug use disorder. At the same time, responsible regulation should aim to take control of illegal drug markets and eliminate profits from illegal trafficking, criminality, and violence. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to responsible regulation, but collaboration is crucial. Events like this are so important. Gathering city leaders, municipalities, civil society, and experts from across Europe, and indeed the world, to share best practices and expertise. Most importantly, communities, youth, and people who use drugs must be included in this process. Historically, people who use drugs are marginalized, criminalized, discriminated against, and left behind, very often stripped of their dignity and their rights. We are destined to fail unless we ensure their genuine participation in formulating and implementing drug policy. Distinguished participants, The evidence is clear. The so-called war on drugs has failed completely and utterly. It is long past time for a new approach. Drug policies that prioritize health and human rights are more effective and more humane. Focusing on inclusion and education over incarceration means that drug consumption falls. Choosing social reintegration over stigmatization means that drug-related infections decrease. And prioritizing people over punishment means more lives are saved. You have my full support in advancing transformative drug policies that center on human rights, prioritize health, protect people, and contribute to more just and more equal societies. I wish you all the best for your discussions.
Thanks for that.
Has destroyed countless lives.
Yeah, again.
I mean, just to say, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is the first ever UN entity that comes in support of responsible regulation. It was a huge step to take. It was a very brave step to take in 2023. It's something that civil society has been calling for many, many, many years. But it's really amazing that the UN High Commissioner is really so strong in his statements and so supportive. And since then, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health has also come out in favor of responsible regulation. So let's move on to our first panelist, who's going to talk a bit about what international human rights law says in terms of what drug policy should be like, because we often forget here that there is something that's called human rights, that is not a taboo subject, and that is a fundamental principle of the UN. So Daniel Joloy is Senior Policy Advisor at Amnesty International. He's been working on the issue of drugs for many years, and really happy to give you the floor.
Thank you, Marie. And thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity to be on this panel, which really comes at a very important moment in which human rights are very easily dismissed, and threats and loud voices seem to count more than evidence and facts. But the evidence is very clear, and as we just heard from the High Commissioner, the war on drugs has failed globally. Not only it has failed to achieve its own questionable objectives of creating a drug-free world, but human rights abuses and the violence facilitated by it have become widespread. Over the years, Amnesty International and many other civil society organizations have documented these widespread human rights violations as a direct consequences of the implementation of policies based on prohibition and criminalization, including police abuses, extrajudicial executions, torture, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, and of course violations of economic, social, and cultural rights, including of the right to health. And even if human rights have clearly served as a parameter to evaluate the legitimacy and the efficacy of drug policies, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how human rights also offer us a guidance of how to do things differently. Human rights provide the practical and substantive tools to design drug policies that are genuinely grounded in the protection of people's dignity. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the growing body of international standards that have been built over the last few years, or even decades, that provide a clear roadmap for drug policy reform, and that even suggest an emerging standard for states to shift away from prohibition towards, that offer that roadmap to address the root causes that facilitate these human rights violations. At Amnesty, we recently launched a policy paper containing and compiling all the international standards that offer this roadmap for drug policy reform. Of course, time wouldn't allow me to focus on all these needed reforms, but I wanted to focus on two very particular reforms that are very much needed and that continue to be very controversial here in Vienna, particularly on decriminalization and drug regulation. So first of all, I wanted to focus on decriminalization, on criminalization, which underpins the international drug control regime and that lies at the heart of widespread human rights violations. Over the years, numerous human rights mechanisms have addressed the prohibition of drugs under human rights and have demonstrated that the heavy reliance on criminal law needs to be addressed or that it's contrary to international human rights law. For example, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health has long concluded that the criminalization of the use and possession of drugs is disproportionate, while at the same time fails both in its primary purpose of preventing harms to health and to achieve drug control. Similarly, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has expressed concern over the criminalization of drugs as it hinders people in need from receiving healthcare. So shifting away from punitive policies is a human rights imperative. The UN Common Position of Drugs significantly points to the need to place human rights at the center of drug policy, calling on governments to promote alternatives to conviction and punishment, including through the decriminalization of the use and possession of drugs. Multiple human rights mechanisms have similarly recommended to decriminalize the use and possession of drugs as a means of protecting the health and human rights of individuals. However, this is yet to be incorporated and appropriated here in discussions here in Vienna. I should also note that both covenants on civil and political rights and on economic, social, and cultural rights impose an obligation on states to prevent human rights violations and to take all appropriate measures, including legislative, judicial, and administrative, to give effect to the rights contained in the conventions. States are therefore obliged not only to prohibit the human rights violations, but also to prevent why these violations are occurring. So it is very clear, as many human rights mechanisms have said, that ending the criminalization of drugs is a clear way to comply with this human rights obligation. Yet, the inclusion and appropriation of this very clear obligation is very away from, and very hard from bringing it to policy discussions here in Vienna. The second area I wanted to touch on is around the obligations to fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights, and particularly how this set of rights relate to drug regulation. Beyond the strong standards on the right to health and the need to increase access to health and social services, the right to health also strongly underpins the move towards regulation of drugs and away of models based on prohibition as a way to better uphold human rights. It is quite unfortunate, however, that even basic standards on the right to health are now being challenged here in Vienna, which is why I think it's even more important that we as civil society continue engaging with human rights mechanisms as another avenue to challenge punitive drug policies and to put pressure on the staunch opposition here in Vienna to actually incorporate human rights at the center of drug policy. As we just heard, for example, the High Commissioner on Human Rights recently recommended states to consider developing responsible regulatory systems for legal access to drugs and to take control of illegal drug markets. Similarly, also last year we saw the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health calling on states to develop responsible and cohesive regulatory frameworks for drugs as a way to reduce overall harm. These recommendations need to be read in the context of the right to health, the right to an adequate standard of living, and to social protection, in line with states' obligations to fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights. Addressing the root causes that increase the risks of using drugs or that lead people to engage in the drug market necessarily passes through the regulation of drugs and the implementation of a wide set of gender-sensitive and socioeconomic protection measures. Other very important standards related to the participation of affected communities and the need to ensure reparations for those who have faced human rights violations in the context of drug policy are also essential to be considered when discussing the path towards regulation. There is certainly much that we still need to do to further develop human rights guidance to advance drug policy reform and particularly drug regulation, but we need to ensure that this guidance is fully developed in accordance with the most advanced international standards. The upcoming process announced a few years ago by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights to develop a general comment on the impact of drugs, it's going to be a huge opportunity for us as civil society to start delineating the state obligations in this regard and to make sure that the issue of regulation is fully incorporated into the standards that the committee is going to be developing. Just as a final thought, I wanted to conclude by saying that, yes, of course, there is still a lot to do to ensure that international human rights standards and that human rights mechanisms continue and increase their attention to address drug-related issues in a systematic way, and for them to provide the structural recommendations to address the root causes that create those human rights violations and to specifically challenge the criminalization and prohibition of drugs. But it is also essential to ensure that states, both domestically and here in Vienna, better incorporate their human rights obligations and to take into account this guidance coming particularly from Geneva, but from other human rights mechanisms, to ensure that drug policies are fully compliant with international human rights law and standards. And I think we really need to start focusing on how to bring Geneva much more into Vienna. And I think these side events continue to be so important to continue talking about these standards and to continue putting that pressure on all states to actually translate what the human rights standards mean for drug policy making. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. And I mean, I think civil society also has a very important role to play in engaging with the UN human rights system, engaging in country reviews to put the drugs issue on their agenda systematically, because that has had a really, really positive impact in terms of what then the human rights system can do to push the issue forward, and then we can bring all of that to Vienna and say, hello, we're all part of the same system. So going from the global to the local, and Daniel has mentioned the issue of engaging and ensuring that most affected people, or people who have been most affected by the war on drugs rather, are included in reforms, in meaningful reforms. And very often what we fear when we move to legal regulation is that the people who have been most affected in the past will continue to be marginalized in a legally regulated market. So we need to make sure that this process is in place to avoid further discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion, for example, for people who have a criminal record and who cannot engage in legal enterprises and all of that. So I'm really privileged to introduce our next speaker, who has just arrived in Vienna for CND, thrown into the deep end. So Coss Marte is the founder and CEO of Conbud and Conbody in New York. And he's going to tell us a bit about his experience in engaging formerly incarcerated people and people who have been most impacted by the war on drugs in a legally regulated environment for drugs.
Hi, everybody. Can I get a hi? So my name is Coss Marte. I'm from the Lower East Side of New York City. I was born and raised there. My mom came from the Dominican Republic when she was 6 months pregnant with me and ended up in New York City in the Lower East Side, where it was a very drug-infested neighborhood. I'm talking about every 10 steps we took, we saw a heroin needle. You know, and so I grew up seeing that as a kid, people lining up to buy drugs as a success story. You know, when I would go to school and teachers would ask me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said I wanted to be rich. Because the guy that was standing in front of that line had a nice chain, had a nice car, his beautiful woman or whatever, multiple women, I don't know. But that looked like a dream, you know, and then listening to Biggie and Tupac and, you know, the hip hop lifestyle, you know, that glorified it, you know, to be what I wanted to be. And I became that person. At 11, I started smoking weed. At 13, I started dealing weed. At 19, I became a multi-million-dollar person where I was making over $2 million a year selling drugs, profiting off of that. And I had over 20 people working for me. This is when we had flip phones, and we were texting people with the 1 1 2 2 3. So I had paid people to text for me. I had 7 cell phones because each phone only held 2,500 contact numbers. And so we had to, I was operating, picking up 2 or 3 phones at a time. We had a queue. I'm talking about New York City. We were reaching 7 million people. You know, sometimes going to Jersey and Connecticut, it was a big, crazy operation. And I'll teach you how to sell drugs later. That's I'm gonna save that secret. But long story short, I ended up locked up 2009, sentenced to 7 years in prison. I was facing 15 to life, and thank God I was in prison at the right time. I don't know if anybody knows New York politics, but Governor Spitzer got impeached because he had sex with some prostitute, and you know New York politics. You know how the shit is. And then Governor Patterson came in. The first thing he did was to reform the drug policy laws on the Rockefeller laws. So these were mandatory life laws. So that means it was my 3rd felony. I'm gonna be, and I got caught with over a certain amount. I'm doing life behind my sentence. So I'm facing 15 to life. I'm going in. This is what I'm thinking. And so I got married in jail in Rikers Island. I got, because my son was 1.5 years when I went inside prison. And so when I went inside, that's when I found out I had a lot of health issues. I was pretty overweight. I was eating cheeseburger, tostones, salami. I'm Dominican. We eat a lot of fatty foods in the street. And so I was very big, and doctors told me my cholesterol levels were through the roof, and if I didn't eat correctly, that I could probably die of a heart attack. And so I started not eating correctly, but I started working out excessively. And I managed to lose over 70 pounds in 6 months, and I helped over 20 inmates lose over 1,000 pounds combined. I came home with a mission after I ended up in solitary confinement. I was in solitary because the officer put his hands on me, and we ended up in a hole. I'm talking about 24-hour lockdown. You had nothing to do. You know, imagine COVID, but just in a room, you know, with just one thing, your religious item. And so all I had was this Bible. And in prison, we use Bibles to smoke. You know, we used to use the papers on back of the Bible to roll joints and stuff like that. And so,
Best paper in the world.
and so yeah, and I got caught for that in jail too. You know, for smoking inside. I have not gotten caught here yet, thank God. But no, you know, while I was in that solitary confinement cell, I had nothing to do. And in that cell, my family found out I was in solitary confinement. I had 2 months left towards my incarceration, towards my release. I ended up doing an extra year in prison behind that situation. And in that cell, I started thinking about what I really wanted to do. My sister found out I was there, and she's Mother Teresa's child. She's like super religious, not me, but I believe in hallelujah, everything. And so she told me to read Psalm 91 from the Bible, and I had this Bible in solitary confinement. Never picked it up in my whole prison sentence. It was just there. All I used to do was write the connections of the Colombian guys that I met, because I might get kilos later from them and stuff like that. That was my mindset. And so she told me to read Psalm 91. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say, Lord, He is my shelter and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. And as I read those words, a stamp fell out of my Bible. And it was the stamp that I needed to send out a letter to let them know that I needed help in this situation, in this box, to get released. I ended up doing an extra year in prison. I was released, but in that cell, I came up with this idea, Conbody, where I transformed my own body while I was incarcerated, and I said I want to get back to society in a more positive way. So I started getting fit, working out, teaching people how to get certified and teach classes. And so I came home, I hired over a couple hundred people out of the prison system. I have a 0 recidivism rate. Right now, I have currently 72 employees working in 4 businesses. The system is working, you know, so how do we align this saying, yeah, I got 2 minutes, but I'm gonna tell you how things are working right now in New York. So New York was the first of any state to do this first, to allow people like myself that's been locked up for cannabis to skip the line. So multi-operators, meaning pharmaceutical companies and all those people, they had to pay $20 million to get into the industry. I had to pay $2,000. And so I for an application fee. Now I just paid over $1 million in taxes in my first year operating. I have the highest retention rate of employment in the industry. The industry usually has a 2-month turnover. Why? Because I'm hired directly from the inside. So we have training systems where we have 8-week internships, train people on what the flower is, and we're talking to New York State officials right now to bring the training inside. So people get certified while they're inside and now could work right when they're out. But that's the next steps, and I'm actually doing that on a fitness level. So I have multiple contracts with Child Services and Rikers Island, where we're training people inside on becoming personal trainers and group fitness instructors, and they're working with us right now. So that's my story. God bless everybody. I don't know how much time I got, but I think I made it.
Thanks so much, Coss. I mean, I think it's really inspiring, and we need more of this. So please keep training people, and I do want to.
And one last thing, because I have 15 seconds, so go to ABC. Always be closing. I'm gonna ask everybody to go on Instagram and follow us, Conbody, CONBODY, and Conbud, COBNBUD. Hit me up. Please DM me. I will answer. And one more thing. We got to think about these pharmaceutical companies because they're cutting our throat, but we could go into the Q&A on that. Just want to put that in there.
Definitely. No, let's definitely keep some time to talk about that after. But for now, let me turn to a little bit more south. Zara is the director of Instituto RIA. We've been working together for many, many years. She's also the international advisor at Acción Técnica Social. And she's been doing a lot of work around legal regulation and what it means to have a social justice approach to legal regulation as well. So, Zara, go for it.
Thank you, Mari. I'm really happy to be here. I feel like this is a continuation of some of the conversations we had yesterday, so I'm not going to do the same presentation that some of you might have seen in the 2 side events we had on cocaine regulation. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited about how we're watching the evolution also of civil society and the debates, and we know that really the innovation comes out of these side events. And I'm also really happy to be here with my co-panelists and to be meeting new people. And Daniel and Eva and I, in 2011, we were young people, and we even did like some videos in Mexico with Drug Reporter, and so we're still here, and that means that we have a strong purpose in what we're doing. So, in Acción Técnica Social and Instituto RIA, we strongly believe in the need to generate evidence. And we know that much of the evidence for the work that we want to do is not going to come from government surveys, it's not going to come from government studies, but rather we have to figure out what it is that moving from a diagnostic, because we're living it in our communities, Colombia and Mexico, we move from the diagnostic to proposals, to concrete proposals. And so in 2017, we started working with the Universidad Externado de Colombia in creating a prospective study using a methodology with a professor forecasting into the future what cocaine regulation would look like in 2034. So we did some workshops here in Vienna. The Mexican embassy lent us the space, saying, it doesn't mean we're in favor, we're just lending you the space, which we were very grateful for. We also did online meetings. And this was in the framework of the peace agreement with the FARC, where there was a lot of expectation of how that might be able to bring different conditions in Colombia. What we know now is that much of that has maintained the same. Gustavo Petro is doing his best to try and implement and go through with community agreements that were made, but there was a very far-right government in between Santos and Petro, so that was difficult. In those years, though, there was, for the first time, and Lorenzo spoke about it a bit yesterday, for the first time in the history of Colombia, a bill presented to fully regulate the cocaine market in the country. This is historic, and I think it also means that us as civil society, we should be proposing bills. We should be taking legislative initiatives. Even if it doesn't pass, you can generate a debate. You're changing culture. We're changing how people are thinking about these things. We're inserting terms into our dialogue. And I think that's what obviously Transform has also done for many, many years. And so this bill was presented. It passed the first debate. It had indigenous senators that had co-sponsored and who had written the bill as well. And now we're in 2025. We have the COCA review of the critical review of the coca leaf, which is pushed by Bolivia. We have Gustavo Petro as the president of Colombia talking about cocaine regulation, saying outright cocaine is less risky than whiskey, for example. And these are statements where before it was the Global Commission that would make these statements, ex-presidents, ex-high-level people. And now we have presidents who are saying this, but they also recognize that they're not going to be able to do it alone. And so that's where with ATS and RIA, we've really been looking at who will be the partners of Colombia in a legal framework for cocaine regulation. Part of the variables that we looked at had to do with the deep web, those are semi-regulated markets when you think about it. Those are places where there are reviews that are done on sellers and buyers. And so if there isn't that same commitment to service, it will come out. And so quality was higher, where there was a trust that was created because there were transparency and accountability mechanisms. And we looked at what that would be one variable out of the 35 variables we were looking at in the study, and how that was going to change over time. And so we now are updating the study in 2025, looking at these variables, but also moving beyond that. And that's where we also look at, there are universities that are now doing research on coca leaf that 10 years ago were not. No, Universidad de los Andes talks about regulating cocaine. They were not talking about that 10 years. The government of Colombia, from the Ministry of Science and Technology, did a huge coca leaf cocaine conference in November of last year, and they opened up a convocatoria for labs, for universities to apply to receive public funding to be able to be doing these research projects. So we're seeing how, and obviously indigenous communities are also participating in this, and so we're seeing how new actors are joining a conversation that we've been trying to foment or generate. And so we're doing two main methodologies in updating the survey, which is around an experts survey. So for those of you who've been following this process, we want to hear from you. There's 55 questions that you can answer if you say yes or no to the question and why. And then we're also doing a survey with people who use cocaine. This also happens and is thanks to the trust that's generated between our organizations and people who use drugs, or your organizations and people who use drugs. So we need the European voice on that. Because in this first round of the user survey, because we were trying to, okay, let's do it all because we have to present at the CND, we have to have everything ready. You're never gonna have everything ready. So we will launch a second part of it following the CND after we've all taken a deep breath. But just in the preliminary evidence that we have of that survey, 80% of the people who were surveyed in this first one, which was more than 1,000 people, 1,154 people responded, 80% said that they were interested in non-inhaled products that might be derived from cocaine or coca leaf. So we could be looking at what is also the spectrum of products that a legal market can offer that might not be hydrochloride cocaine, but it could be these little tablet capsules that they're putting, so it's like mambiar, but you put it in your lip. Or, you see the snus, so you can put like something that's similar to and so what would be other products that would be possible? And in the Rotonda, you have the Bolivians who are giving out sodas that have coca leaf. And so it's also about what are less risky products that could be provided, understanding that 95% of the cocaine that's consumed in the world comes from Colombia, and that it is the majority of the coca cultivation in Colombia is destined to become hydrochloride cocaine. The other thing is that 82% of those who responded to this survey from users would pay more for cocaine that was produced under we're not saying fair trade because it's not a term that's very hard to reach, and also it's not always super fair, but fair market criteria. And what fair market criteria looks like is that currently, the cocaine market, less than 2% of the revenue gains of the cocaine market stays in Colombia. Less than 2% stay in the country of origin. That is crazy. That means that no one is getting rich off of this in Colombia, or very, very small. 68% of those revenue gains are generated in the countries where it's consumed. This is where it's like, there are people dealing drugs in your countries, so there are people who are making so much. And drug dealers are my friends. Like, they are and I have been there, and we all had entrepreneurial spirits when we were young people, and that's important. But so this is where so we really need to think about how are we redistributing resources across a production chain that already exists? How do we transition folks who have been in an illegal market to a legal market? And that means recognizing tools of oppression and privilege that have existed. I have them as a white woman who lives in Mexico. I'm Mexican, but I have dual citizenship. I mean, all of these things are, how do we make it so that anyone can be speaking about these issues? How do we make it that this is not our little ivory tower where we're talking about this? And so it's also recognizing then how are we going to build in mechanisms of reparations within the revenue gains that are generated in these production chains. And so that's what we're really looking for when we're thinking about fair market criteria. How do we redistribute resources? How do we ensure that cultivating communities form part of this? How do we move towards pilot projects? And we've been having these discussions since 2017 with different cities, with municipalities, with countries on what would it look like, and we're seeing this with the cannabis trials that are happening in many European countries, what would it look like to do a small-scale pilot project where cocaine would be coca leaf would be cultivated, transformed, produced in Colombia, sent to European countries, probably. That's the most likely scenario, because we don't see Canada and the US getting on board quite yet. But how could we do that so that then there would be a safer supply distribution in the countries where it's being consumed? And this means a non-medicalized model, this means a research model, this means people who are willing to participate in studies, which I think in Switzerland they were very surprised that so many people wanted to participate in the cannabis trials. And I think we would all be not so surprised to know that lots of people would also want to be having their human rights respected by participating also in cocaine trials. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zara. And I think it's really amazing to be able to get the input of people who use drugs. When we put together policies that are meant to address their needs and their wants, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of the use of drugs is for pleasure. So we kind of need to understand what can we do to bring the illegal market into the legal realm so that the illegal market is as minimal as possible. But that can only be done if we actually respond to the needs of people who are engaged in that market. Another person who has been working for many years on legal regulation.
He's so young though, still. So he was a child.
He's getting younger every year. Don't worry. I think Transform was probably one of the first organizations that came to the UN to open the space around regulation. I think we owe a lot to Transform for opening that debate for us. So Steve Rolls is working for Transform, and he's the expert on this issue. So yeah, you've got the floor, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Association for Safer Drug Policies in Norway. And I just want to just congratulate them because they are an awesome organisation. They set up relatively recently, 6-7 years ago, something like that.
They're 20 years old.
Totally take it back.
He's getting older.
No, take it back. Anyway, they do amazing work, and thank you for organising this forum. I think in terms of when we're looking at the evidence, as Daniel's already said, where the evidence is very clear is on the systemic failure of the existing drug control system, and it's really remarkable when you actually read something like the World Drug Report, because it's all there. I mean, you know, there's lots of stuff that isn't in there, but the failure of a policy that is specifically designed to reduce the size of drug markets, to reduce the availability of drugs, and to reduce the use of drugs, where every single year for more than half a century it's been going in the opposite direction. It's hard to imagine something that could be more of a failure. And the only way that you can really project prohibition and an enforcement approach as a success is to selectively choose certain process indicators like seizures or arrests or, you know, acres of crops eradicated or something, and go, look, we're succeeding, look how much drugs we've seized. Obviously, you look at the outcomes in terms of public health or development or environment or human rights or, you know, any of the core principles of the UN Charter. The outcomes are terrible, and it's all there either in the World Drug Report and the publications of the drug control system itself, or the documentation produced by civil society like IDPC and the shadow reports and the annual reports that we produce. It's very clear that that's not working. So I guess the question then is, what is the evidence for doing things differently? What is the evidence for reform? What is the evidence for decriminalisation? What is the evidence for regulation, which is what I've specifically been asked to talk about? Obviously, if you're trying something new that hasn't been done before, it's inevitably speculative. But there are established ways within social and public health policy for policy to grow and evolve. You map out a concept, you decide on what your objectives are, you decide on your indicators, you do pilot projects, you do trials, you carefully monitor and evaluate them, and policy evolves. And if it's working, you continue. If it's not working, you reevaluate. You're flexible, you evolve. That is how policy evolves in all areas of health and social policy, in human rights policy. And we shouldn't really need to be saying that. It's kind of obvious. The reason we need to say it is because the war on drugs is not an evidence-based policy. It's essentially a political and ideological program based on these sort of, moral binaries, and it's framed as a war against an enemy. It literally says that in the 61 Convention. It describes drug addiction as an evil that we must combat. It's the only mention of the word evil in any UN treaty. It's weird. It's like Voldemort. It's like Harry Potter or something. We're fighting evil, and this isn't Harry Potter. This is the real world. But the fact that it exists in this weird moral binary space, rather than in the sort of norms of social policy and evidence-based science policy making, that is the change that we have to make. And if you do that, it only leads in one direction, which is away from the failings of a punitive enforcement model towards a pragmatic, evidence-based model that is rooted in principles of public health, social justice, human rights, sustainable development, and so on. And we shouldn't need to say that because it should be obvious. But in this place, it's not always been obvious, but it is increasingly so.
Yeah.
And now something like decriminalisation, that's been going on for a long time. There's an increasing body of evidence. There's lots of great literature on that. I'm not going to dwell on that. But even the UN system has come in behind decriminalisation now. So the common position on drugs, which is all 31 UN agencies, unambiguously calls for the decriminalisation of people who use drugs. So that is there. We did get there eventually. Regulation, it's a lot harder. We're not there yet. We have one UN agency thus far that's come out, the Office of the High Commissioner, we heard from Volker Turk earlier, has come out unambiguously in favour of regulation. Essentially through a human rights lens, and this is what Daniel was talking about. I think if we look at regulation generally, it's important to remember that we already regulate loads of drugs. Some we regulate really well, some we regulate really badly. Alcohol and tobacco, where there's a lot of good practice and bad practice in regulation for alcohol and tobacco. And the World Health Organization provides copious guidance on how to responsibly regulate these two very dangerous drugs, high-risk drugs that kill lots of people, how to regulate them responsibly for non-medical and scientific use. And the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, go and read it, it's a remarkable piece of work. It's about how to regulate tobacco, which is the most risky drug of all in many ways. I mean, the World Health Organization is saying that at current rates, 1 billion people will die from smoking by the end of the century. 1 billion people will be dead from smoking. And then here's the guidance on how to regulate it responsibly. Yet they don't provide any guidance on how to regulate cannabis responsibly, even though many of the same issues apply around commercialization and corporate capture and marketing and promotions and all that, and controlling availability and price and all of that sort of. Sorry?
But not death.
Not death. Yeah, you generally don't die unless you're driving or something.
Or it falls on top.
Yeah, a big bale of it lands on your head. Okay. But what we have now with cannabis is interesting. It's what I would describe as a laboratory of change, because all around the world, on every continent, there are regulation models of cannabis emerging, and they're very different. You have the kind of state control model in Uruguay. You have the non-profit homegrown association models that are emerging in Europe. You have the more sort of commercial, sort of alcohol-like models in many places in the US, and everything in between. In Thailand, it's a sort of pretty much a free-for-all. Now, not all the outcomes from that are going to be good. And we need to be honest about that. Legalization regulation isn't intrinsically good. You still have, once you pass that threshold, you still have to do it well, and you still have to, policy still has to evolve and learn. And mistakes are being made. I'm sure you'd agree mistakes have been made in New York, and certain mistakes have been made in Uruguay, mistakes have been made in Canada, everywhere. Mistakes have no doubt been made in Europe. We have to learn from them as scientists, and policy evolves. You see what works, you see what doesn't work, and you grow and change on that basis. That is the problem with the dogmatism of the war on drugs, is it doesn't evolve. It's fixed, it has a sort of almost quasi-religious dimension to it, where it doesn't evolve. And of course, as has already been alluded to, and what Zara was talking about, is that the debate is now going beyond just cannabis. Cannabis has been incredible progress over the last 10 years. There's like 500 million people now living in legal cannabis jurisdictions, and there was none 10 years ago, zero. So it's worth bearing in mind that change is possible and is happening and is accelerating. But change is moving beyond cannabis now. There's interesting things happening with psychedelics around the world, particularly plant-based psychedelics. There's the amazing things that are happening in Switzerland and Amsterdam and Colombia in terms of the debate around cocaine regulation. And we are in a period of change. But if we abide by basic scientific evidence-based principles, policy can only move in one direction. And my final note would be all of the big wins in drug policy reform, all of them, whether it was harm reduction in the 80s and 90s, whether it was decriminalization in the 90s and 2000s, or whether it was regulation, cannabis and now other drugs in more recent years, it's all been driven by local initiatives and civil society. We take the risks. We adopt those political risks that our so-called political leaders have been afraid to take on, and we are driving the change. But we do it by taking the risk, getting the evidence, and pushing forward a pragmatic public health, science-based approach. So that is how change happens. I don't think we can look to the UNODC to be giving us guidance on how to do this, unfortunately. They are a dogmatic prohibitionist entity. They are not a supporter of regulation in any shape or form, but other more pragmatic UN agencies are. That debate is opening up. We need to be supporting and informing it and driving it in the right direction. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. And talking about civil society as drivers of change, I want to pass the floor to my last speaker, Arild, who works for the Norwegian Association for Humane Drug Policy. And actually, I'm really sorry because I see you've changed your name, so it's no longer FHN, it's FHR. Arild has been absolutely amazing at pushing the debate in his own country and advancing the rights of people who use drugs, advancing harm reduction, advancing the debate on decriminalization, and now on legal regulation. So he's one of my drug policy heroes. It's always a pleasure to welcome here, introduce him for this side event. So Arild, you've got the floor.
Thank you so much. And the reason why we want to have this event, it is because we are at a drug policy turning point. We need to explore the evidence for drug law reform. Therefore, we ask the best panelists in the world to tell why we need a drug law reform. And I come from Norway, the rich country with a Nobel Peace Prize, with the best politicians, so much money, oil money. We're so rich, we're so evidence-based, we're so human rights-based. Also, in a lot of drug policy, we should be proud. We have, Steve said he wants to thank another organization. That's because we have 5 drug user organizations, a lot of drug policy organizations. We get so much money. All of them should be acknowledged. I thank you, Steve. We have substitution treatment. We have with buprenorphine and methadone for thousands of people. And we say we need more medications. Okay, we bring in the morphine. We need heroin-assisted treatment. Okay, now we have heroin-assisted treatment. And what is that? That is legal regulation of what they call narcotics. just a few years ago. We have drug consumption rooms in several countries. We're changing the law so it will be more available. Our great politicians, do you know our politicians? We have Jens Stoltenberg, the former Secretary General in NATO. His father, his name was Thorvald Stoltenberg. He was fighting for a drug law reform. This is our pride. And still, we had a conservative government suggesting decriminalization. We almost got it, but a right-wing party went out of the government, so we barely got it. And we have this great government now also. They want to decriminalize for some. But it's great because, you know, we were drug dependent. We were the multi-criminal. We were treated more bad than anyone. They are being decriminalized now. And we're expanding the harm reduction and everything. And also in the parliament, 3 parties now are they're minority, but they're in favor of legal regulation of cannabis. But if you go to Norway and say you want legal regulation of cocaine, we need this conversation. We need to focus out in the world on human rights, on indigenous people. We need to focus on evidence and human rights in Norway, in Europe. We have to take care of the indigenous people in Latin America. We have so much to be proud about. That's the conversation we need. And now we have 10 minutes for Q&A. But before that, John Melius is the guy who has made this event all these years with a great leader. Every year you have been here, I would like to thank you so much. And John Melius, if you feel the love, the brilliance, he's here among us.
Definitely, that was going to be my closing remark, but yes, thank you so much to John Mellis because he's been really amazing at bringing us all together year after year. And thank you, Arild. So we do have 10 minutes. I hope you're inspired, invigorated. So we're going to take a first round of questions, go back to our panelists, and then a second round. So I've got one here and then one there.
Fredrik Nilsson, I'm also from Norway. I'm a Swede, but I'm working for another organization than Arild, and we have a really good cooperating work together. I don't know if many of this is not a question, but it's a comment about Norway and drug policies. In 2013, nice, because it would explode, but it still did with steroids. So I think if we can somehow look at it and connect, then maybe we can have a more even fight about this discussion.
So another intervention here.
Yes, sorry. So, I mean, it's not so much...
Sorry, can you just introduce yourself?
So, yes. Yeah. My name is Colin Johnson. I'm from Toronto, the Toronto Harm Reduction Alliance. I'm here as part of the Canadian delegation, but I'm not speaking on behalf of Canada. I'm speaking on behalf of my organization, which is a drug user organization. I'm going to disagree with you on your theory that the war on drugs has failed. And I'm going to... If you just give me a second. The war on drugs wasn't really about, it was about control, specifically about black populations and minority populations. I'm speaking specifically of the United States and parts of Europe. It has not failed, because they've still managed to do that. And you touched on criminalization. I mean, that whole thing, the most criminalized people are not just people who use drugs, but in North America are people who are black. Once you criminalize them, then they don't have the rights, as you pointed out, to just about any frigging thing. They can't do anything. So I get where you're coming from. It's failed in the sense of what they officially said it was about, but I think that's a lot of hogwash. It was never about that. It was about control and ensuring that people, specific people, did not have a flipping chance to get anywhere and survive in this world. On that basis, I agree with you going forward. We definitely do need to make challenges to a lot of the laws and regulations, and that's where groups like us come in. But sadly, to do that, we need fucking money. I mean, the world does not run on goodwill. I mean, I don't care what you want to say. You know what I mean? And I don't know how we're going to do it. Maybe you can help us figure out how to make money, quote, legally. Or we might have to go back to your old ways. But, you know, we need those fundings to be able to go to court, to be able to get lawyers, to be able to by politicians, because let's be honest, folks, this isn't about some guy coming together and sitting down and saying, I want to do a good thing. He's been bought. His ass has been lobbied and bought. Sadly, we have to do the same stuff. Thank you, that's all I want to say.
Thank you.
I was really amazed because Enrico Fletter from European Coalition for Just and Effective Drug Policies.
Yay.
And we are also making something on Friday on cannabis in Germany, going very strong. Now, before coming here, I discovered two really curious things attaching to him. First, why beer was forbidden in the States. And they forbade hamburger was not called anymore, even kraut was forbidden to call it, and then beer. So they tried to make it light, but then said it's beer, it's connected to Germans. So even that was a kind of a racial profiling for establishing. But the second thing, which really curiously came upon, is that in the US there's still slavery. Because Abraham Lincoln said you can be abolished slave, but not in the case you are a prisoner. So the whole system is relating to, it's really invigorating, so it's a slavery system provision also. And that's what we have to fight. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I literally have written, because I understand Steve, and when he's talking about the war on drugs has failed, and I think we all are on board with, but I had literally written, war on drugs has failed, but for whom? And that's the thing, because in Latin America, it's that the war on drugs has been used as a justification for militarization, for military intervention, so that the United States can put in military bases all over the region. And because it has been used as a piece of economic, social control, and political interest, to be able to push forward so much more. And that's where then we see that prohibition is actually completely entrenched in so many other policies. And that when you put a criminal past on people, you then don't allow them to have access to any other opportunities in their life, and then you can continue to maintain social control over certain populations. And so that's where it then comes, and we had a lot of problems with that when we were pushing for cannabis regulation in Mexico, because they were unwilling to look at getting rid of simple possession as a crime. Because simple possession, for example, is the easiest crime for police to prosecute, because you really just have to go up to anyone and, oh, look what I found, Daniel. Look, I found this. And you're like, okay, but there was no victim, there was no and so they use that as a means of extorting people on a daily basis. And so then we're contributing as people who use drugs, or even just people who look like we could be possibly profiled in some way, and I don't fit into that, but like we're watching young people, we're watching brown and black people, this happen to them, and in Mexico even more, if you have dreads, if you have anything, and then it's used that then we're participating in daily corruption that we have no interest in participating in. I think it's the only movement where we're demanding to pay taxes. Tax me. I want you to do something so that I have to. Yes, it's like, and there's no other, I mean, and we have marches where we yell, tax us already. But it's like, because, and that's where it's, and I spoke to it briefly yesterday, but it's also that like, as soon as there are legal avenues where people can have a safe supply of substances, we can start to look at reducing illegal markets. But while there are not those avenues, then it's not our fault that these policies are in place. That people in Europe want to snort cocaine is not a problem. It's not a problem for Colombia if there was a way for Colombia to safely supply without violence regulating that market. And so it's really a straw man's argument, and the prohibitionists try to push it. It's just, it's your fault because you guys are using cocaine. No, it's not. And that's why we work on a daily basis to try and change those policies. But they try and do that because they're also trying to create fractures within the movement. They're trying, and in Mexico, we've worked really hard, for example, to work with movements of people, of family members, who have family members who've been disappeared. Because that was also a tactic. That then they would say, it's your fault that there's a war on drugs because you're a person who uses drugs. It's your fault that my son was disappeared. No. These are state policies that are pushing that. And we have more than 100,000 people who've been forcibly disappeared since 2006 when the war on drugs was officially declared, and it continues to happen. And so they're using that. I mean, the state, it serves them to fracture us, to not have us be working together, to not intersect with other movements, whether that's climate change, whether that's feminist.
That woman.
So it's just one of these things where, if you were talking about steroids, it's like, how do we begin to work more together? How do we begin to take our messages to new audiences? And we gain new audiences when we also diversify who are the people speaking to these issues. And so when there are more people of color, Black and brown, indigenous communities that are participating, then we see that there's greater participation because then we're having more messengers.
They can't afford to.
They can't.
The black and brown community.
Yeah.
They're so kind of just trying to survive there.
But the New York experience is really interesting because they
And
said
I'm
we're
gonna
going
be
to give
talking to
all
people about
the first licenses to people who have been incarcerated, who have been criminalized in some way, or you have some sort of agricultural experience. It doesn't work that you just get to be like, I'm a business person, so now I want to set up a grow. No, you have to show. No, it's that I used to grow tomatoes, I used to grow cannabis, I used to whatever. And so they've gotten criticized for going slow, but they're going intentionally. And that was the difference between the other states. And every state that regulates cannabis in the United States, I think, is going a little bit further in trying to push what's that agenda and what are the outcomes that we want. And in New York, the numbers are very positive. The Housing Works was the first one to have a dispensary, and that they didn't have money to be able to run their programs for people experiencing homelessness and people with HIV. That's huge. And so we can be learning from those. And then if it's not working, we go back and reevaluate.
Yeah, thanks, Zara. You'll bear with us for another extra 5 minutes, I think, to give the floor to others. But I think the sense of solidarity, I think, is really, really important, especially right now that there is massive, drastic funding cuts for civil society all over the board. If you could just react, and then we'll go back to the people who haven't been able to speak from the panel.
Yes, my name is Farid Shariati. I represent the civil society as an observatory on the Norwegian delegation. And I'm Secretary General for an umbrella called Prevent FIO, without the N. So I agree with, I think we all agree on most of the issues pointed here. But in Norway, people are talking about the legalization of cannabis and how that can remove and cripple the illicit drug market by taking away a part of their market, and how that can help people in poverty and so on. But that's, in my opinion, there's lacking some part of the analysis, because if we just legalize and the state takes in taxes without having programs for what those taxes are going back to, then the state just is taking in money, but the issue is still remaining. People, and especially low-level drug dealers, are doing it because they need something they need a roof over their head, they need food on the table, and actually, without those low-level drug dealers, a lot of people wouldn't have food in their neighborhoods. Yeah. So how, and that's why I thought of it, because you said about the housing project. And I think it's very important that we hit home that not only legalize, but those incomes has to go back to the civil society, not civil society, but communities that we as civil societies represent.
I think the discussion has moved a lot in terms of legal regulation. I mean, for a very long time it was just legalize, and now when the debate started advancing and government started legalizing, we're like, okay, what do we want? And I think the social justice angle now is getting stronger and stronger, but obviously it's not necessarily the key priority for jurisdictions that are moving toward legal regulation, so it really will be our job as civil society to keep pushing for the social, racial, gender justice. So why don't we just take it like this, Arild, and then Coss, and then Daniel and Steve for the final words.
Thank you. I want to thank Colin for bringing in your important perspective. The war on drugs is a success for repression, but it's an utter failure for preventing people from using drugs. It's a success for human rights violations, but you can get it anywhere in the world, all the kind of drugs. So. And the New York experience, Farid, that's why we brought Coss here. Where do you want, watching this video, sitting here in the room, where do you want Coss to be? In prison or here at the UN at an event talking to you? He's a resource. he's so much worth. That's the way to cheat people. He's been a drug dealer, and we can't only discuss drug use, we must discuss all the people and include them in the framework of the legalization model, of course. So we need the Geneva spirit into Vienna.
It's a very thin line, right? And first of all, I want to you made me think about, I got locked up so many times. I got stopped over 300 times by NYPD. Over 300 times, like 2-3 times every single day. Yo, you smell like bud, get on the wall. Put your hands behind your back. I had to stash my weed in my ass to smoke, to go outside. Now I could smoke freely outside, legally. And so, but, we're talking about how reform works inside. I'm actually pushing and talking to a different state, and I can't even share what I'm doing, but it's about raising the minimum wage inside. I was working for 7 cents an hour.
Yes.
The 13th Amendment states if you're incarcerated, you're subject to be a slave. There's still about less than 5 states that actually don't pay you at all for working. In New York State, I was getting paid 7 cents. That 7 cents added to my $40 of a bus ticket trip home and my restitution that I had to pay to the state, $300 after serving all those years, right? 7 cents adding up, right? How the fuck I'm gonna go home with $40 on a bus ticket? I'm gonna go to McDonald's on my first stop, because this is a 9-hour ride. We stop at McDonald's halfway, $20 at McDonald's, because it's the first meal out of prison. You get to the city, you got $5 on the train, you got $15 you wake up with. What happens? What happens? So there has to be a source, and we already, I feel like we have a proven concept that works. And we actually, so I made $7 million in revenue last year. $7 million in revenue last year. $1 million of that went in towards taxes. 40% of that $1 million goes towards back to the neighborhood, to nonprofit organizations that apply for a grant that's gonna go out right now for $100,000 each. So that's organizations in my neighborhood. They're not even talking about what we do on top of what we do. Like we do cookouts, block parties. We do bring the culture to what cannabis is and what the street, and we do it respectfully. You respect us, we respect you, and everybody wins. And I think there's a win-win situation, and I think a lot of people are seeing it happen in New York. But getting back to the medical side, now the medical operators paid this big nugget. It's like, you in Six Flags and this guy has a Go Pass and he skips everywhere. That's how they live. Rich people don't like to get skipped. I skipped them. And this is proven in court because I hired a lawyer to intervene in a court case that beat the multi-state operators that hid behind veterans and opened up the market for over 200 people in New York State that had convictions. So if we did not beat them in court and deal with that, this market would never succeed. Now we had $1 billion in sales last year, $1 billion, close to it. That's a lot of freaking money, and that's just the beginning. And we're just scratching the surface of the black market. And I believe the black market should still exist. I believe that person that's selling in the project for $60 ounces down the block, kudos. I'll give you the weed. Here, sell it free, But there's different levels, A smoke shop that used to kick me out of the store for selling weed in their store, and now is getting a license to sell a couple blocks away from me. Fuck you. Like you crazy? You was against this drug, and now you seeing this making money. Now you want to jump into this line? No, that's not justice. I think there's the majority of the people want to see justice, and they're seeing justice. But if we see these big players, big bank eat little bank.
Yes.
And so they drive the prices down because they're the only ones that are allowed to grow in the industry and sell at the same time. So now when I sell $150 ounce, you know, to a consumer, and I'm getting it at $75, right? I'm getting $75 ounces. They're selling it at $90 ounces to the consumer. How do I compete with a $15 margin? I can't. So, well, how do you deflect that from, you know, being? You have to put regulations. You only could be in everybody's shelves 5%, 10%. You know, there's a Whitney economic report that I could show you that's really seeing the trend and is proving the fact that the money is being made and is real. I had 76 smoke shops, illegal, in a 6-block radius. I competed with all of them and I won, you know, because I got the community behind me and because the people know I'm still your dealer. You know, and so that's I think people respect it and it's working, and I think we have a model that I would love to promote, but we have to be careful with big bank eat little bank, because when those big banks eat little bank, this thing collapses and you have people now, you know, taking out mortgages and loans to try to just survive and pay rent. I'm paying $47,000 in rent every month. Because it's cannabis. You know, so think about it.
Thank you. And I mean, there's so much to learn, and I think that these practical things really need to come to the table. But I know we are completely out of time, but Daniel and Steve, please, final words before we close the event.
I'm going to be very, very quick, as I know everybody needs to run to other events. But just to pick on this point on social justice, I think particularly us, organizations like mine in the human rights movement, we have so much to learn from the social justice movement to ensure that whatever we are talking about, we are bringing actually the affected communities, those who have been at the front line, to be the ones guiding whatever we are doing. Because yeah, it's totally true, like those racialized communities that have been mostly affected throughout the years, for many years have not had a seat on the table, and we need to make sure, like it is also our part and our role to also make sure that our platforms are open for those voices. And I think we take that very, very seriously, and I thank you for that comment.
Yeah, Colin, I also completely agree with you. I think a key thing to remember is that we are in a period of transition and change, the transformational change that Volker was talking about. There is an amazing opportunity with legalization regulation to do things differently and to do things better and to design a market architecture that meets all of our aspirations and needs in terms of social justice and human rights and public health and all of our other shared goals. But we need to be working on it now. It's much easier to do it when the legislation is being drafted than to try and retroactively fix legislation. We've seen that with the battle to rein in big tobacco. You know, once the big corporations have taken over and dominate the world, dominate the policymaking process, it's really hard to move backwards. So we have an amazing opportunity to have real influence now in how this market grows and emerges. And civil society is absolutely essential to that. So we have to make sure the right people are at the table. And we have to, be feeding that evidence. Our advocacy needs to be full on now, because in 5-10 years, it's too late.
Okay.